Alright guys, welcome back. Today what we're going to talk about is the idea of, the Federalists and Jeffersonians and, just how that, first party system is going to work to create, the modern United States that we, kind of live in. We're going to go through, and I've called it, troubled times for a new nation because the Constitution was not set up to deal with political parties. And so what that meant is starting from Adams, one-term presidency through the two terms of Jefferson's presidency, we're going to see some of the expansion of the federal government, some changes, new amendments, and just the American government itself trying to come to grips with how to be a functional nation. We're probably not going to go through everything in this lecture. It is a little long. There's some stuff that, will help you to keep you from having to fully read the book, but, pardon me, I never have to make sense until I actually go to record these. But, we will be hitting the majority of the slides, so, please, follow along as normal. So the election of 1796 is really the first modern election in American history, in the sense it's now for the first time, you have people actively out campaigning, you've got, intrigues, manipulations, you've got, two political parties each trying to get their person into the White House. And because you weren't at the time voting for a particular ticket, you're actually voting for a person. Because remember the way the Constitution initially, and by the way, I realize that I've got, the glare here, so I do apologize. But, because you're actually following or, voting for a particular person, what we're going to see is Alexander Hamilton, who sets himself up as being kind of the leader of the Federalists, stuff like that. He wants, he can't be president. He was not born in the United States, so he cannot be president. But he nonetheless wants to manipulate it. So what do we see is he hates John Adams. So he wants to get Charles Cotesworth Pinckney elected. And so what happens, he tries to skew the election there, and it splits the vote sufficiently that while Adams will be elected, Thomas Jefferson will get the number 2, vote. What this meant is because now we've factionalized into the Federalist, of which Jefferson is a Federalist, John Adams is a Federalist, and the Democratic Republicans, of which Jefferson is the leader of that party. What we're going to see is, the president will be of one party, the vice president of another, and nothing gets done. This is going to lead directly to the 11th Amendment because this desire of you have to set this up differently. Because if political parties are here to stay, the Electoral College, as, originally designed, is not sufficient to work. It's just not going to be able to work well. We're also going to see this as a problem because everybody is divided because we're still going on with the issues of the French Revolution. That's not exactly coming to a halt. In fact, that's escalating when in 1793 France declares war on Great Britain. So what we're going to see is in the United States, the Federalists either want strict neutrality or they want to go to war against France. The Jeffersonians either want to be lenient to France or possibly join them in a war with Britain. And so it's in that mentality we're going to see what's called the quasi-war breakout. This is somewhat similar to what we're going to see with modern wars in the United States, in that it's undeclared, but we're going to fight it anyway. What happens, France is, I won't go so far as to say it's losing the war with Great Britain, but it's going nowhere. The French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, it's still going on. There's not really been any progress made. So what we see is out of this desire of economic necessity, French privateers, which are a form of legalized piracy. These are, in effect, pirate ships given what would be called a letter of marque by the French government, saying you can go and attack ships of this nation that we are at war with. And these ships start seizing American vessels, the idea being twofold. Either they need these goods in France to help their economy, or they want to make sure that we don't trade with Great Britain and thus help their enemy. And this goes on, this starts in 1797. It's going to go until 1799. Realistically, it won't end until 1800. And what we're going to see is the Federalists want war. They want, just declare war on France. Let's fight it out. But Adams remembered Washington's presidency. He remembered that, sorry about that. I had to pause. I kind of lost my train of thought there. He remembered that the United States, Washington had said this, the United States was not actually equipped or prepared for war. So if we can't fight a war in 1790, say, 2, we're still not prepared in 1797. But Adams realizes there has to be, some sort of, there's got to be some sort of intervention. So what he chooses is a limited, undeclared naval war. He orders that American merchant vessels be armed for their protection. The Navy had just begun, and their construction was rapidly enhanced, of 6 wooden frigates. This idea being, we're going to build this small, really tiny genesis of a navy. And the thought was, let's not escalate the war with France, but let's at least show we are not going to be pushed around. And so out of this, we're going to have a number of naval battles. Like here, I'm displaying, the American frigate Constellation taking and capturing the French frigate Insurgent. And what we're going to see is, the French captain, here, just for you guys to spice this up, here's my bad French accent, would say, Monsieur, you have caused a war with France. I have no idea how good that was, but you're stuck with it. That's going on the internet for posterity. Well, the American captain, Truxton, will reply, well, Monsieur, if I have started a war, I am glad, for I detest things being done in halves. Well into 1799, American ships and French ships are fighting it out. There's numbers of naval battles in the Caribbean, but there's no clear winner. All everybody knows, this is sapping resources, sapping manpower, and it's leading nowhere. Neither side wants outright warfare. But part of the problem is that France does not take the United States seriously. The new, French government of the French Revolution, then when Napoleon takes control in 1799 and establishes the Directoire, or the Directory, these guys do not take the United States seriously. And we'll see that with the XYZ affair and this really, really goofy, hey, he's French, what do you expect? But this really goofy, cartoon depicts in part the American reaction. Because what happened is Adams sends commissioners to France with the idea of, look, let's actually sit down, let's have trade negotiations, let's solve the war, let's put an end to our problems and move on. Well, what happens is, as we're doing this, we also want compensation for the fact that our ships were seized, and we want an official end to the 1778 Treaty of Amity and Commerce. Washington said that the treaties, remember, had been with, King Louis, but the French still maintained that we technically were in violation of that treaty. The treaties were still, on the books. They should still be ratified. What happened is our ministers go to France, and 3 ministers, identified only as X, Y, and Z, though one of them was a Monsieur Talleyrand, who would be very influential in Napoleon's government up through Waterloo. What they did is these French ministers demanded a $10,000 a piece bribe just to open negotiations. That's not $10,000. These guys don't want $10,000 for peace. They want $10,000 just to talk to the United States. That is how much in contempt France, of all places, France. I mean, vive la France, don't shoot. France held us in that much contempt. And so what we're going to see is Americans, irrespective of party, are insanely pissed off. The Federalists continue to want war, and this more or less discredits the Republicans, because the Republicans had been pushing, remember, their Francophiles. They want, they'll have guys like Thomas Jefferson, who, writes the Declaration of Independence. He will, spend time in France. He urges support for the French. Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, who urged people to independence, goes to France, urges people to accept and help the French Revolution. And so what we're going to see is politically, this is the Benghazi attack of their day, basically. It just completely divides the two political parties. And what we're going to see, that quasi-war continues. This is 1799, and it continues and continues. And because of that, there begins to be a push that maybe the United States needs a standing military. The Army had only been a few thousand. The Navy was tiny. I just saw a CNN op-ed that, can the Navy get by with 273 ships? At this time, the Navy quite literally has a dozen. That's pretty much it. So Hamilton, among others, want to use this war, to justify a standing army, in part because if the army is called up, he expects Washington will lead it. And Washington is old. How old? He literally surpassed dirt a couple of years ago. So Washington will not be able to effectively command in the field. Hamilton served under him. Hamilton has military experience, and so Hamilton hopes that Washington will nominate him as the commander instead. Why this is important, we're not going to spend that much time on this, but why this is important, it shows that the Federalists are no longer fully unified. That there's not, okay, I don't know what that is. No. That there's not, just a Federalist Party, there's not just a Republican Party, but now, you have high Federalists, you have moderate Federalists, you have, various types of Republicans, and the whole political system is starting to fracture. And we only have parties for a limited time at this point. So we're going to see that John Adams, he gets caught in the middle of all of this because he doesn't want to, take orders from Hamilton. I mean, he is the president of the United States. But at the same time, and it's a historical fact, a president without a party cannot get that much done. And so we're going to see he gets the responsibility for passing, two pieces of legislation that the Federalists want that are, we can't say unconstitutional. Judicial review does not exist yet. But these clearly go against what had been intended with the American Revolution. We're going to see that with the Alien Act, the president could deport any foreign national he sees fit for the good of country in wartime. And wartime was, taken very loosely because, remember, the quasi-war is undeclared. So what that meant is rather than going through Congress, rather than the rights of the individual, rights of the citizen, what it meant is the president could just simply say, you're a foreign national, I deem you a threat, you're expelled from the country. That's it. The Alien Act also said that Congress, if they had a majority vote, could do the same. Any foreigner, by decree, and it upped the citizenship requirement from 5 years to 14 years. And the reason was, in this war, we were becoming somewhat xenophobic, in the sense that we don't like outsiders. And we were terrified. I mean, this is, at some level, the voter ID law of its day. We're terrified that people are going to come over from France, live here for a few years, start voting, put the Republicans in France, the Republicans in power, the Republicans are beneficial to France. Bear in mind, these are Federalist laws. They bind the whole nation, but the Republicans do not support, either one of them. I have not been yawning all day, and I hope this is not an indication of how boring this is if I start yawning. If we do, that's a problem. Might have to do a headstand back here. Now, for as bad as the Alien Act was, the Sedition Act was worse because it said that anybody who criticized the government was guilty of libel and thus could be punished by fines or imprisonment. What that means is libel is slander. As it was best explained to me, and I really hope this shows up on a test, if you call somebody a fat, dumb bastard and he is overweight, he, has a low IQ, and his parents weren't married, you're telling the truth. It might not be tactful. It might be crappy. You might not want friends like that, or you could be like me and just be, laughing. But you're telling the truth. You've not committed a crime. But if you call somebody a fat, dumb bastard, and he's none of those things, you have committed libel. You have slandered that person, because bastard in this day and age was more than simply a swear word or a derogatory term. It implied that your parents were not married, that you were the bastard son or bastard daughter of somebody, not married to your, I don't even know who that would be, father, mother. You're not married to, one of your parents is not married to the other. That's the takeaway. So what we're going to see is this conflicts with the First Amendment, which says, among other things, the freedom of the press. You can print whatever the hell you damn well please. And theoretically, the government cannot come in and, throw you in jail. The Sedition Act, however, because it's targeted at those Republican newspapers. Bear in mind, every newspaper of the day was Fox News. And what I mean by that, Fox News has a conservative bent. There's no denying that. MSNBC has a liberal bent. I'm pretty sure no one's going to deny that. We today were like, oh my God, newspapers, media outlets should be impartial. Please. Historically, newspapers were owned by political machines. Nobody cared about the facts. They cared about how you could spin the facts. And so what you have with the Sedition Act was a hope to silence those Republican newspapers from criticizing the American government, then dominated by Federalists. Now, the thing is, because this, clearly goes against the First Amendment, we then, we take one bad law, and then we create a very, very, very dangerous precedent. This idea, this specter, if you will, of nullification. I say specter because it starts here in the 1790s and doesn't go away at all. I also choose Spectre because, I don't know about you guys, really looking forward to Spectre on October 2nd. Huge James Bond fan. Okay, never mind. So, what we're going to see is you have probably the two most influential statesmen of the day. James Madison, author of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. And now this is more important because bear in mind, the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, is seen as the founding document of the United States. James Madison, who largely wrote the Constitution, the founding document of the government of the United States, in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, proposed the idea of nullification. What this idea blatantly says is they said that every state had a moral obligation that if they believed a law was wrong, they could nullify or not enforce them, that the law itself was not binding. Why that's a problem is who determines if a law is good. At the moment, the Supreme Court does not have that power. But this is the case. With nullification, we're going to see it in the 1830s with the form of the tariff, in the sense the South doesn't want to pay the tariff, so they say, well, we can nullify it. We'll see it with civil rights, when people don't want to desegregate, so they try to see if they can nullify a federal law. The issue of slavery, because nullification means that, if you can nullify a law, if you can pick and choose the government, why do you even have to stay in the government? So nullification leads directly to secession, the idea that you can just pack up and leave. And even most recently, and I really hope you've been paying attention to modern events, because realistically, history is made all the time. And maybe at the time, nobody realizes history is being made. But in 100 years, some enterprising guy like me, trying to make a career, most likely trying to write a book, because he doesn't want to get a real job, will go out. Sorry, I just heard a car alarm out my window. That's always distracting. Well, go out and he'll find a little nugget and he'll write a book about it. The Kim Davis thing in Kentucky. That, on a small scale, is what nullification is about. States have passed gay marriage bans. The Supreme Court of the United States says that no, those bans are unconstitutional. There is no legal reason to not marry, if two guys want to get married, two women want to get married, there's no binding legal reason to do so. But Kim Davis has claimed that these have violated her religious beliefs. I don't want to get political. I myself have problems with that argument because I think that she's picking and choosing her beliefs, but that's neither here nor there. But by not issuing, by refusing to issue marriage licenses, she has attempted to nullify what the Supreme Court said. Now today, obviously, we recognize that the federal government is superior, and that's in large part thanks to the Civil War. So what we're going to see is, hang on just a second. Yeah. So what we're going to see is that because of that, that's why she's thrown in jail. Today there's that governmental process that we know, okay, individual people cannot nullify the law. After all, what's to keep you from nullifying a speed limit? Keep you from nullifying a health code if you say, well, it's not a good law. But in the 1790s, not only has that not been established, because again, it's still the question, these states united or one federal government. But when you have the two men who arguably have created the United States as a functioning governmental entity, saying that yes, you can do this, people take it seriously. And this creates a dangerous precedent that, at some level, in some cases, we're still dealing with to this very day. Now, while that's going on, Adams is finally able to secure peace. In what we'll call the Treaty, or the Convention of 1800, or the Treaty of Morfontaine, they're the same thing. Adams basically says, screw you to the Federalists. He then sends more commissioners to France, and, pretty much says, no, don't take no for an answer. Don't bribe. We still want to end this war. Now, in addition, as a sign of good faith, as well as to cripple Hamilton, Adams unilaterally starts to get rid of some of that army structure, starts to dismantle the army, and starts to want to bring things, de-escalate, if you will. He wants to end that reliance on the military and the fact that the United States has been fighting a war for 3 years now. Sorry about that. I adjusted the lighting, so hopefully that'll, cut down on the glare. It'll also make it look like a weird, abrupt, horrible CBS editing job. But with this desire for peace, with the desire to try to de-escalate, there's also something else. Napoleon has taken power in 1799. We're not quite to the French Empire. That's 1801, 1803, somewhere in there. But now with Napoleon wants to stop dealing with the United States. He wants to fully concentrate on his war against Austria and on his war against Britain. So he is more than willing to sign a treaty that ends the quasi-war, as well as abrogates those 1778 Treaty of Amity and Commerce, and finally secures lasting peace. Adams has done it. This is his crowning achievement. But there's a slight problem. The treaty is signed on September 30, 1800. But we vote for the president in November 1800, and it's still a 2-month boat ride. Word of this treaty does not come until Adams is already voted out of office. Hopefully I didn't spoil it for anybody, but there you go. So along with that, we get the first truly modern election. And I'm going to say that about 1796, 1800, and 1896, so stay tuned. But with 1800, what we're going to see, and here's just a rough electoral map, is that now with the political parties in full swing, there's no clearly popular successor to take over. Washington had been elected unanimously. Adams was seen as Washington's successor, was elected with 1 vote shy of being unanimous, and that elector said that only George Washington deserved to be, elected unanimously. But with the election of 1800, also known as the Revolution of 1800, we're going to see the first modern election, truly modern election, in the sense that political grandstanding, the parties are going to be nasty to each other. I'm actually going to post a video link to the course to YouTube that's got some actual writings from the election of 1800 as if they were in the style of a modern campaign ad. But let's just say that, there are numbers of penis jokes and, allegations of rape, basically. That quite frankly, they say that if Jefferson gets elected, he has, his downstairs doesn't work, and that if Adams gets elected, rape will plunder the land. That or I've got him backwards. But either way, we'll save it for the video. So there's people distrustful of the process of 1796. They don't trust the other parties. The 2 newspaper machines are just going at each other. There's all of this hatred, vitriol, and I mean, quite literally, it would be as bad, if not worse, as Facebook today. I mean, that's how bad it is. Hamilton once again tries to manipulate the election, and this time he screws up big time. He inadvertently splits the Federalist vote so bad that the 2 Republicans, Jefferson and Burr, these 2 guys, Jefferson and Aaron Burr, get the top 2 votes. That means that no matter what he does, no Federalist is going to be elected to the presidency or the vice presidency. But there's another problem that also shows how frail the system is, because Jefferson and Burr tie in the Electoral College. And what that means is, as per the Constitution, it goes to the House of Representatives. There's no hanging chad, so they don't have to go to the Supreme Court, but it does have to go to the House. It takes 36 ballots. 35 of them had, nobody could decide. And then finally Hamilton realized that he hated Aaron Burr just that little bit more than he hates Thomas Jefferson. And so he gets a group of representatives to switch their votes, vote for Jefferson, and Jefferson becomes president. Never mind will of the people, never mind the Electoral College, the House of Representatives, for political means and one man's ambition, chose who was going to be president. And Jefferson, I don't want to say he's a bad president. I mean, the guy's incredibly intelligent. I mean, Bill Clinton in the 1990s hosted a White House dinner for, I believe, Nobel Prize winners. And he said something to the effect of, "This is the most intelligent conversation in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone." I mean, this guy is brilliant, but he's not that great of a president. In fact, when he dies, he says, "Remember me for the Declaration of Independence, not for being president." But what is significant? I mean, never mind what comes through. Never mind, that Jefferson will start building up stuff that will lead to the War of 1812, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. But what's important, why this is called the Revolution of 1800, is this is the first peaceful transition of power between the two opposing sides. What I mean is, if you look at Washington and Adams, they're both Federalists. They believe the same thing. There's no surprise there. But here, you have two groups that hate each other, but there's no riots, there's no violence, there's no civil war, there's no people getting angry, dogs and cats are not living together, oh, the humanity. Props if you caught the Ghostbusters reference. Sorry, that just reminds me of, I love my wife, but I have this fascination with quoting movies, and it drives her nuts. And that's when I learned that my lovely wife, who is herself a child of the 80s, never saw Ghostbusters until quite literally a year ago. If you're facepalming, you get it. So what we're going to see is this Revolution of 1800. It meant that it's the continuation of that anti-federalist tradition. Okay, well, we didn't get elected. We're not going to hold on to power. We're not going to fight to keep power. We're not going to say, screw you guys, we're taking our toys and going home. But instead, we'll just try again 4 years later. We'll find a better candidate and try again. What this meant is this sets the tone for that transition of power between two political parties, and it's something we have even until this day. I mean, I remember, 2008, 2009, Michael Moore was saying how he did not think George W. Bush was going to give up power. That, Bush would try to stage a coup, and I mean, just all this inflammatory rhetoric. But then January 2009 came, and he hands off power to Obama. And just as, in January of 2013, sorry. What year is this? January 2017. Sorry, all the frickin' campaign ads, I'm already getting confused. January 27th, I just realized if I reuse these videos and I do this in a not election year, you're going to be, what the hell is this guy talking about? But in January 2017, or for those of you watching this in a few years, in January 2021, I have no doubt that President Obama or President insert, name here, will have no problem handing it off to President insert name here, no matter what the political affiliation. So even though you don't like the guy, even though, you disagree politically, you hand it over. Now, before it all sounds too cheery, we're going to see the emergence of this guy, Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court. And why I say it's too, a little too weary, or too cheery, to insert whatever here, is because the Federalists did want to hold on to power. And they realized, well, if we can't hold on to it here, what about create new judgeships so that judges can interpret the law with a Federalist bent? And so what we see is at this time, people didn't take their offices in January like they do today, but they took it in March. And so what we're going to see is after this, after November, the Federalists passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. They create all new circuit courts that hadn't been there. They create 16 new judge positions. We're going to have what will be called the midnight appointment because John Adams will literally stay up till midnight the day, his last day in office, filling out these appointments saying, you're going to this judgeship, you're going to this, you're going to this office. But again, there's no Facebook, there's no telegraph, there's no efficient postal service. We still don't have an efficient postal service. And so what happens is it falls to the new administration, and particularly Secretary of State James Madison, to actually hand out these appointments. Well, Jefferson wants to set up his own stuff. Jefferson doesn't want to be bound to what Adams did, so the administration refuses. And you get this guy, William Marbury, who he appeals to the Supreme Court, and he says, look, I was duly appointed by a president of the United States to take this courtship. The new administration refuses to seat me, this is a problem. We need you to educate on that. And so what we see is John Marshall, who is, he is probably one of the most brilliant people in American history, and he's seldom acknowledged for it. Marshall realizes that if he sides with Marbury, he's siding with the Federalists. He realizes if he sides with Madison, he's siding for the Republicans. And the issue is, at least now, they want the Supreme Court to seem impartial, to seem like they don't go or lean either political way. So he's really, he's trying to find a way out of this, and then he finds the most brilliant and at the time seemingly inconsequential maneuver. He says that, the Supreme Court does not have the jurisdiction to actually, adjudicate this case. And he says that part of the Act of 1801 was unconstitutional, that how they had done it, how they had created these new judgeships, went directly against the Constitution. In doing so, what he tries to do is actually remove the Supreme Court from having to decide. But accidentally, he creates what we'll know forever as judicial review. The idea that if there's a lawsuit, a Supreme Court can rule a law unconstitutional. What has to happen, if you don't like the law, you have to break the law. Then you'll probably be tried in a state court. Then you appeal. And if the federal court will hear it, then you're tried there. And if you don't like it, you appeal. And it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has the authority to say that whatever law does not, it violates the Constitution, it is unconstitutional, and thus is null and void. With this dramatically enhances the power of the Supreme Court, because now more than simply just ruling over decisions, now they can actually check and balance what Congress does. Later on, this concept will be taken to things such as executive orders, and so this allows the Supreme Court to provide an accurate and effective check and balance to both the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. They could check the judicial, I don't know, check themselves, wreck themselves, I don't know, whatever the kids these days say. Now that has more long-lasting implications for us, in the sense things are, tried by the Supreme Court, every year. But we also have to deal with, again, that whole issue of the American paradox, slavery. It's still there. And we're going to see in 1800 the first of the, and there's not that many, but the first of the big slave rebellions. It's called Gabriel's Rebellion. And it's led by this guy. Now, his last name is not Prosser, but slaves typically at this time only had one name. And so to help identify a slave so you don't have 10 Gabriels, they would often tend to use the master's last name. So many people record his name as Gabriel Prosser. Now, what he wanted to do in 1800 was organize a slave rebellion in Virginia. At this time, the slave codes were somewhat relaxed. You could walk down to the next plantation. You could talk. Slaves could get together in the 5 minutes they had for free time. And what happens? He tries to plan this fairly large rebellion. He knew something of history. He thought that maybe what would happen are poor whites, and even those Jeffersonian Republicans that kept espousing that slavery was, if not wrong, at least that all men are created equal, that, it should be the rich v. the poor v. the rich, not, North v. South. He also overlooked that most Republicans were slave owners and from the South, but details. Now, the thing is, this rebellion never actually takes off. He's discovered. Another slave from another plantation tells his master, who then sends a note to James Monroe, the governor of Virginia, who then mobilizes the militia, who then captures Gabriel. Gabriel will then be executed along with 23 other slaves. But what comes out of this are two things. One, we see a new repressive slave system. And I know that sounds like a, bit of redundancy, repressive slave, But in this system, now it becomes illegal to teach slaves to read and write. It becomes illegal to teach them religion. It becomes, that you're going to have armed slave patrols roaming the countryside. The rights of slaves are really, really, really clamped down. But the other issue is this is the start of a, and we'll pick up with this after, the first exam, but the start of a changing mindset on slavery. That instead of being, remember, that necessary evil where you're holding the wolf by the ears and you dare not let go. Imagine, if you will, you've put a lot of work into something and you don't like it, you're going to get rid of it, so it's necessary enough. But then people start criticizing it, and you remember what you put into it, you start defending it. Unfortunately, the same stuff happens here. This is the start that by the 1830s, we're going to see that necessary evil argument will disappear in the form of a positive good. Because people want, slave owners want to see themselves as friendly, as caring. They want to see slavery as kind of a patriarchy that, slave owners help and are kind to and take care of and nurture slaves. And, this is really what starts the shift. Don't really worry about taking that many notes on this slide, but understand, part of why that's so important is because the majority of the United States is still agrarian. We still live in farms. Only 7% of people live in cities, and cities, you don't live in them. Generally, you trade there. You manufacture stuff there. Generally what you would do in this agrarian vision is, you'd live on your farm, you grow subsistence crops, then you grow a little bit more that you would then take to market and trade. So you didn't have to buy stuff, you didn't have to make stuff, you could just grow extra stuff and trade it. But the issue is the majority of industry, and I'm going to air quote industry here, is the transportation industry. That, making something is what is, the most lucrative. And it makes sense because shipping and transport are so expensive that if you were, say, and I believe I mentioned this before for this class, but I'll go ahead and do it again, not like you're watching this anyway. But in Ohio, okay, if you wanted to ship something overland to New York, it was cheaper to walk it to the Mississippi River, build a boat, sail it down, destroy the boat at New Orleans, put it on a ship, and then sail it over to New York. Doing that shipbuilding, transportation, the occasional horse and buggy, horse and cart, that's where most people made money. We're going to see the Industrial Revolution is still a long way off. Railroads and canals are still 20 to 30 years off. And so people really want to just stay on their farms. Also in part because as there is not that much in actual industry in the city. Cities are seen as areas of cesspools, they're disease-laden, vice. A lot of times during, not flu season, but it would be like the typhoid season. You'd vacate cities. And you consider this, our capital, Washington, D.C., would have to be vacated for like 6 months out of the year because there's horrible sanitation. You literally would crap in a bucket and fling it out in the street. Talk about a crappy situation, right? But in doing so, disease is so bad, and there's no concept of the germ theory, there's no concept of cleanliness that, it was hazardous to your health to risk living in a city. So by and large, most people still live, in fact, on farms. Now, that just kind of sets up Jeffersonian society just a little bit. But some of the other things we're going to see is part of what defines Jefferson as a president and the society is he's going to want to try to reform the government. And for him, reform meant undoing Federalist legislation, repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, and also the bright idea of abolishing all direct taxes, simply tax imports. Now, I say bright idea because I'd love that. I mean, my paycheck would go further. But the problem is, by basing taxes solely on imports, what happens, and this is horrible foreshadowing to next lecture, what happens if the two most prosperous trading nations on Earth start seizing your ships and you don't get money? What happens if, to hit them in the pocketbook, you then have an embargo where you agree to not trade and you stop all trade? What happens to your pocketbook? Jefferson makes the economy weak. He has huge spending cuts, which are great, but he goes further than the modern GOP, the modern Republicans. He really just trashes down the size of the military. What he does is he says, okay, we just need gunboats to protect our coast, so we don't need a navy. All those brand new ships get mothballed. He says, well, we don't need a standing army because it's a threat to liberty. So the army shrinks down to just a few thousand people. He also closes embassies. He says, look, we have no need to talk with, I can't even think off the top of my head, but he's like, look, we don't need an embassy in the Middle East. We don't need to be able to talk to the Barbary states. So no, we're just going to close that embassy to save money. He takes spending cuts, and here's, again, I consider myself a modern Republican. I consider myself conservative, but there are limits. Spending cuts are great, but if the government spends too little or doesn't have enough revenue, it simply can't function. We're going to see that here soon enough. There's also the issue of political patronage, because Jefferson wanted yes men, so he had to go through every new office, fire the Federalists, find out, what their political leanings were, and then bring in somebody he thought competent who also happened to be a Republican. It's not been crystallized yet as what we'll come to call the spoil system, but there's also the whole issue. It's whereas Adams wanted to keep people in place to ensure a smooth transition, Jefferson wanted to redress the whole government from top to bottom. Now, Jefferson, as much as I like him, still a Hamiltonian fan, but we'll get to that. Jefferson also was the original flip-flopper. He's the original John Kerry. He had been a strict constructionist. This idea that if the Constitution doesn't say you can do something, you can't do it. Well, what happens is he wants trade. And so what we're going to do is he'll send negotiators to France, now under the control of Napoleon Bonaparte, to try to buy the port of New Orleans. People would often literally just buy cities at this point. Why? Because New Orleans controls trade on the Mississippi. Well, by this time, Napoleon has made France somewhat so great that they've taken control of Spain, which means all of that land that France had lost in the French and Indian War, they get back. Napoleon wants to use his North American stuff to grow food, to feed slaves on Haiti that he needed to make, I believe it was sugar, molasses, rum, stuff like that, to sell for export. But there'd been the Haitian Revolt. The slaves had rebelled. He sent an army. Guess what? European armies are not resistant to Central American diseases. And so his army dies. He no longer needs this land. So we go and we offer $10 million, a huge sum of money, for just New Orleans, just for New Orleans. And Napoleon says, well, you know what? If you pay me $15 million, you can have the whole damn thing. I'm not using Louisiana Territory. You can have the whole thing. This presents that constitutional dilemma. And I've got some slides out of order here, apparently. So bear with me. The problem with what we're going to call the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 is that where in the Constitution does it say the United States can purchase more land? If this had been Adams' presidency, Jefferson would have been horrified. But Jefferson, and his party, although they were strict constructions, they're tempted by the deal. They're tempted by the Labor Day coupon. They see this as a really good deal. And $15 million for, in essence, double the size of the United States is a fantastic, fantastic deal. So Jefferson tries to figure out, how do we do this? He first wants to go slow, propose a constitutional amendment. Let's make it where the Constitution says we can do this. But then there's the whole issue of what if Napoleon changes his mind? So he simply tells the negotiators, just buy it anyway, we'll sort it out later. Correct decision? Yes, absolutely. But there's also the issue that he has no problem violating his principles when it so chooses. Now, Jefferson also considered himself a man of science and a man of exploration. So as we buy this thing in 1803, he puts together what we're going to call the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Now here we have Meriwether Lewis, I believe it's George Rogers Clark, and when I was a kid we said Sacagawea. I hear a lot of people today saying Sacagawea. It's an online class, so I'm never going to hear you pronounce it, so however you want to say it is perfectly fine. Now it's going to be funded by the government in 1803, and the whole idea is twofold. One, they want to find what they're going to call the Northwest Passage. Historically, Okay, here's my mouse pointer. Historically, there had been the hope that somewhere there would be a waterway. Many people thought it started with the Hudson River that would go from the United States, from the east coast of the United States all the way to the west. That theoretically there was one big canal through, North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And for the benefit of the reverse image, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That had been the hope. These guys want to try to find it. They also want to see how epic is the Louisiana Purchase. Why? Napoleon didn't even know how big it was. All he could say is, it's a great deal, it's a great deal. You'll be fine, you'll like it, you'll buy it. Napoleon is apparently a used car salesman. He's not going to give you the Carfax report, he'll just tell you to buy the damn thing. So these guys are out there trying to figure it out. And I mean, they leave in May 1804. In December, they're going to reach the Pacific Ocean, and it takes them until September 1805 to return. And I mean, you can actually still find their journals. I mean, they're about that thick. I mean, they do a lot of surveying. They make a lot of contact with various Native American tribes. I mean, that's where Sacagawea comes in. I mean, they use her as a guide. And so what we're going to see is by seeing just how vast this is, as well as the fact they spawn a theory of what will be called the Great American Desert. That everything, around in here is nothing but just desert area. That they think it will take generations for the United States to actually settle this land. If Jefferson was correct, and Jefferson was brilliant on so many things, but so apparently here's his stupid moment. You and I would just now be settling the Louisiana Purchase. And that's not even taking into account there's still all of this land behind it we still have to add in the 1840s and 50s. Now, one of the problems with this, and again, just yet another Jefferson flip-flopping, is, remember, not the Constitution, but the various land ordinances had said that to form a state, what you would do is the individuals in the state would form a republican form of government, make a territory. Then, with a certain amount of people, they could then apply for statehood. But who lives in Louisiana? Well, it's Spaniards, it's Frenchmen, it's Native Americans. And because of the fear that these guys are not loyal, Congress pushes what we'll call the Louisiana Government Bill, and they sign this completely abrogating their own process to create a Louisiana territory and to subdivide all these territories without listening to what the actual people want. How long will it take to actually settle this? Realistically, one of the causes of the Civil War will be the Kansas-Nebraska Act just opening all of this for settlement. I mean, this will take a large amount of time. So if those are more, things going on in the developing United States, we also have to deal with now, the crumbling of two political leaders in 1804 and 1805. In 1804, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, they never liked each other. They outright hated each other. Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel, and Hamilton accepts. Now, dueling, how it would work in these days is, if you're challenged, you would get a friend who would serve as a second. The idea being if you chickened out, he'd take your place. That's what I call a really good friend, by the way. You would then meet your challenger and his second, and you would fire pistols at each other. You don't have to shoot the other guy. You don't have to kill the other guy. It's simply to say, look, I'm brave enough to go through with this. Now, dueling is illegal. By the way, Burr is the vice president of the United States. What happens in 1804 is they meet. Hamilton takes his gun, fires it up into the air. I mean, he's not going to shoot the VP of the United States. Burr, however, takes aim and boom, hits Hamilton right in the stomach, and Hamilton dies a few days later. Now, the joke might be crass, but realistically, this makes Aaron Burr the first of two sitting vice presidents to actually shoot somebody. There are a couple of differences. Burr killed Hamilton, Cheney did not kill his friend, and Burr at least had the common decency to not go, "Quail!" He at least knew he was shooting a person. I'm just saying, how do you shoot somebody in the face and think he's a bird? Food for thought. Now, Burr, this costs him a lot of popularity. This costs him a lot of issues. So then what he decides to do is he wants to create his own private army, go attack a Spanish colony, probably Florida, and then tear off a section of the United States and create a new United States under his leadership. He's going to work with a guy named General James Wilkinson. He wants him to be his overall commander. But Wilkinson gets cold feet, he tells the president, and Aaron Burr will be arrested. So now, this guy's political career is just skyrocketing. He barely gets into office, then he shoots somebody, then he, is arrested and tried for treason. This is incredibly serious. The sitting vice president of the United States tried for treason. Now, the Supreme Court finds him not guilty, and they do so mostly to piss off Jefferson. But it's actually incredibly important. What is the penalty for treason? It's death. You're either hanged or they put you up against a wall and shoot you. The Supreme Court said why they found him not guilty is because they needed firm evidence that treason was actually a motive, that this guy actually wanted to do this. Now, granted, he probably did. Burr is a giant a-hole, but they come up with the idea that, look, you have to have hard evidence. You have to be able to say, look, that is a treasonous act. You can't just simply say, one of you guys can't simply, go tell somebody, oh, yeah, well, I heard my instructor, Dr. Prince, was going to commit treason by, punching, throwing a pie at President Obama. I don't know. I thought about saying other things. I'm like, this is going on the internet. I'd rather not have this strategically edited. So we'll hit Obama in the face with a pie. It said, no, we can't have hearsay. We have to either have a direct confession, yeah, I did it, or we have to actually have hard evidence it took place. Because the problem with hearsay is if you start accepting hearsay, how far removed is that from the old absolutist monarchies of, I think he's a threat, so we'll kill him and we'll sort out the details later. Or what is it, the Monty Python, what is it what they would do with witches? And I wish I was kidding and saying it was a Monty Python thing, but they would actually do this. They would say, to see if a person was a witch, they were going to attempt to drown her. If she didn't drown, she was a witch. If she did, well, then at least her family would know that her soul had not been tainted by the devil. Kind of sucks if you're the person that drowned. It's that same thing. Here, you have to have physical evidence that you have or had a scheme to commit treason. You cannot simply just, somebody said that he saw or somebody heard you say you wanted to commit treason. What this does, again, the Supreme Court is crafting out that rule for itself, and it's doing its best to make itself as impartial as possible. Is it impartial today? Of course not. We're too plugged in. We have too many political opinions. But good justices will rise above that and say that, look, even if I don't like this law, even if I don't like the politics, even if I don't like the president, from a legal standpoint, there's nothing wrong with it. You don't like it, don't sue, fire your representatives who voted for the darn thing in the first place. Along with that, we need to deal with the issue of the slave trade. Remember, the Constitution said that 1808, that's when the United States could start to end, the international slave trade, or at least the trade of slaves, the importation of slaves into the United States. Now, this is a delicate subject. The South, remember, it's transitioning from necessary evil to positive good. But guys like Jefferson, they might be slave owners themselves, but they see the slave trade as wrong. They see it as, look, if slaves are already here, that's one thing. Don't bring any more. Don't bring anybody else. But those divides, we're not quite to what we'll call the slave power conspiracy yet, but the divides are already there. The North wants a strong bill. Not only do they want to ban the importation of slaves, they want to stop the slave auctions in Washington, D.C. Quite literally, within eyesight of the Capitol, you could watch slaves being auctioned off. You'll have this thing of, give me liberty, give me death, America the free, and then you've got a slave auction going on. But the South, they simply want to, look, we're fine with ending the importation of slaves. Why? That makes their slaves more valuable. But we want to be able to continue the intrastate slave trade. We don't want it ended in D.C. you're not going to be able to do anything else. And so what we're going to see is out of this, for the first time over the issue of slavery, people start asking, what about civil war? If the North is too harsh, will the South simply take its toys and go home? So we see, and it doesn't fully happen just yet, but we see some people start to say, well, look, we need some sort of law. We need to codify a regulation of slavery. Are there, rules to regulating slavery? How far can slavery expand? What role can the government do to stop it? What role can the government not do? Can slavery be protected? Is this going to be a state issue? And that's what some people want, is that if Delaware wants to, not Delaware, that's a bad example. If New York wants to ban slavery, that's perfectly fine. But if South Carolina wants to keep slavery, as I'm in a horrible southern accent, I have no idea what that was, we'll stop now. If South Carolina wants to keep slavery, then the federal government should have no business to tell it otherwise. Why this is important is it feeds into the sectional and regional divide. And I said sectional, not sexual. I'll probably make that screw up later, don't worry. Is what we're going to see is the United States might have come together under Washington and might have come together with the Constitution. But by, say, 1809, when James Madison takes over as president, we're going to see the nation is really divided. And we're going to see two huge divides, one political and one sectional. What we're going to see, Jeffersonian America, you've got the cities. They hate, the urban areas. You've got the rich that are, the rich are getting rich, the poor are getting poorer. There's not a huge gap yet, but there's still this whole idea, remember, you've got to be a, property owner, a white male property owner to vote. It's simply not enough to have, to be white male. It's not enough to be male. It's not enough to even be a human being. You have to own property, which means the wealthy's votes count for more than the poor's. Because of slavery, as seen with, the slave trade and Gabriel's Rebellion, North and South want to go their own separate ways. They want to live different things. They want to do different stuff. The North wants to impose its will on the South. The South is determined to refuse the North the ability to actually do that. We're also going to see that, the Federalists, with the death of Hamilton, they have no true leader. So that party, it's still there, but it becomes a state and regional party. I mean, it will never again be able to successfully challenge for, the presidency. And because of that, the Democratic-Republican Party starts to split because you have guys that want some Federalist leanings, but they don't want to go too Federalist. You have other guys that want, more Democratic tendencies, others that want more Republican tendencies. And Jefferson, as we see with 1803, has to balance the fact that he, he's ideological, he hardcore believes in republicanism. And this idea of, the government can only do what the people allow it to, but he has to balance that with pragmatism in the sense, look, there might not be a mechanism to get, to buy Louisiana, but $15 million for, twice the size of the United States, that's a hell of a good deal. Why would you not do that? And so what we're going to see is with these divides, James Madison will be elected president, but it's with this fractured United States we're going to see the United States embark on its first major war since the Revolution. And that's going to be the War of 1812, which will pick